This is a true story of the night two German U-boats surfaced off the coasts of New York and Florida, landed 8 trained Nazi saboteurs on American beaches, and launched the only significant enemy attack on U.S. soil during World War II. Operation Pastorius, launched in June 1942, sent agents armed with nearly $175,000 in cash, crates of explosives, and detailed plans to blow up bridges, railroad terminals, water facilities, and aluminum plants across the eastern United States. But within days, the entire plot unraveled when George Dasch, the mission's leader, suffered a crisis of conscience, walked into FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and confessed everything. By August 8, 1942, less than 2 months after the saboteurs landed, 6 of the 8 agents had been executed in the electric chair following a secret military tribunal personally ordered by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. What you're about to hear is not just about a failed sabotage plot, it's about American fear in the months after Pearl Harbor, the constitutional crisis triggered by Roosevelt's military tribunal, and how close Hitler came to bringing the terror of war directly to American cities. This is the story of Nazis on U.S. soil. Context: America's vulnerable home front. Let me take you back to early 1942, to the dark months after Pearl Harbor, when Americans lived with genuine fear that enemy attacks could come at any moment. Japanese submarines had shelled oil facilities near Santa Barbara, California. German U-boats prowled the East Coast, sinking merchant ships within sight of beaches from Florida to Maine. Coastal cities enforced blackouts at night. Residents were forbidden from turning on lights that could silhouette ships for U-boat torpedoes. Civil defense wardens patrolled neighborhoods, enforcing compliance and watching for suspicious activity. The fear wasn't irrational. Before Pearl Harbor, German intelligence had successfully planted spies in the United States. The most famous was the Duquesne spy ring, 33 German agents who operated across the U.S., stealing military secrets, photographing defense installations, and transmitting intelligence back to Berlin. By mid-1941, the FBI had arrested all known members of the Duquesne network, but Americans knew there might be others, sleeper agents, sympathizers, saboteurs waiting for orders. And they were right. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was enraged by the collapse of his spy networks in America. He demanded that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, immediately launch a sabotage campaign inside the United States. Canaris warned Hitler that any operation involving more than a handful of men risked exposure. "Someone always talks," he said. Hitler didn't care. He wanted American factories bombed, bridges destroyed, and the U.S. home front terrorized. So Canaris ordered Lieutenant Walter Kappe, who had lived in the United States during the 1930s, to recruit and train a sabotage team. Operation Pastorius was born. Training and planning, building the sabotage teams. Walter Kappe began recruiting in 1941 from Germans who had recently returned from the United States. He needed men who spoke fluent English, knew American culture, and could blend in. The leader was George John Dasch, a 39-year-old waiter who had lived in New York for nearly 2 decades and had even served briefly in the U.S. Army. Dasch spoke English without an accent and knew New York intimately. Another recruit was Ernest Peter Burger, who had obtained U.S. citizenship before returning to Germany. Burger had initially been enthusiastic about the Nazi regime, but had become disillusioned after spending time in a concentration camp for minor political offenses. The other 6 agents, Heinrich Heinck, Richard Quirin, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel, Herbert Haupt, and Edward Curling, also had extensive experience living in America. 2 had U.S. citizenship. The team trained at a sabotage school near Berlin. They learned to construct and detonate bombs, mix incendiary compounds, and identify vulnerable industrial targets. They practiced fake identities, memorizing detailed cover stories. They studied American geography, culture, and current events so they could pass as ordinary citizens. The training included a grim protocol. If any saboteur showed signs of weakening or wanting to defect, the others were instructed to kill him without compunction. Each agent was given forged identity documents, birth certificates, social security cards, draft deferment cards, and driver's licenses. They received nearly $175,000 in American currency to fund a 2-year sabotage campaign. They were given detailed target lists: aluminum plants in Tennessee and Illinois, railroad stations in Newark and Philadelphia, hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls, the Hell Gate Bridge in New York, and Jewish-owned businesses. The plan was for the agents to land, bury their equipment, blend into civilian life, and begin sabotage operations. Cape planned to arrive in Chicago months later to coordinate the campaign. In late May 1942, the 8 saboteurs boarded 2 U-boats at Lorient, France. U-202 carried Dasch, Burger, Quirin, and Hank and was headed for Long Island, New York. U-584 carried Curling, Thiel, Haupt, and Neubauer and was headed for Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. Think about what this means. Less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Germany was launching a military operation against the U.S. mainland, not with bombers or battleships, but with saboteurs armed with explosives and cash, sent to destroy American infrastructure and spread terror. Landing. The night. Everything started to go wrong. On the night of June 13, 1942, U-202 surfaced about 300 yards off Amagansett Beach on Long Island, New York. The 4 saboteurs, Dasch, Burger, Quirin, and Hank, climbed into inflatable rafts. Dasch nearly drowned during the launch and paddled to shore. They wore German Navy uniforms during the landing so that if captured immediately, they could claim prisoner of war status rather than be treated as spies. Once ashore, they quickly changed into civilian clothes and began burying their uniforms and 4 crates of explosives in the sand. Then something went wrong. A 21-year-old U.S. Coast Guardsman named John Cullen was walking his patrol along the beach when he encountered the saboteurs in the fog. Dasch, thinking quickly, approached Cullen and claimed they were fishermen who had run aground. When Cullen grew suspicious, Dasch stuffed $260 into his hand and told him to forget what you saw. Cullen pretended to accept the bribe, then ran back to his station and reported the encounter. An armed Coast Guard patrol returned to the beach within the hour and found 4 crates of explosives, German uniforms, fuses, and pre-made bombs hastily buried in the wet sand. But the Germans were gone. They had already taken the Long Island Railroad from Amagansett Station into Manhattan, where they checked into hotels. The FBI, informed by the Coast Guard, initiated a manhunt, but they had no names, no descriptions beyond Cullen's vague account of seeing men in the fog, and no idea where the saboteurs had gone. Meanwhile, on June 16, 1942, U-584 successfully landed the second team, Curling, Thiel, Haupt, and Neubauer, at Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, without incident. The 4 men buried their explosives and equipment, boarded a bus to Jacksonville, and then traveled by train toward their assigned targets. For a brief moment, 8 trained Nazi saboteurs were loose in the United States, armed with explosives, cash, and plans to bomb American infrastructure. The FBI didn't know their names, they didn't know where they were, and they didn't know another team had landed in Florida. The betrayal, Dasch's crisis of conscience. Back in Manhattan, George Dasch was falling apart. The encounter with the Coast Guard had unnerved him. He realized that the mission was more dangerous than he had anticipated and that the chances of success were slim. On June 14, 1942, the day after landing, Dasch called Ernest Burger into their hotel room, opened a window, and told him they needed to talk. If they disagreed, Dasch said, only one of us will walk out that door, the other will fly out this window. Dasch confessed that he had no intention of going through with the sabotage mission. He hated Nazism, he said, and planned to turn himself into the FBI and expose the entire operation. Burger, who had his own reasons to despise the Nazi regime after his time in a concentration camp, agreed immediately to defect. On June 15, 1942, Dasch called the FBI's New York office, gave his name as Franz Pastorius, the namesake of the operation, and tried to explain the sabotage plot. The agent who answered thought he was a crackpot and ended the call. 4 days later, on June 19th, Dasch took a train to Washington, D.C. and walked into FBI headquarters. This time, he gained the attention of Assistant Director D.M. Ladd. For 2 days, stunned FBI agents interrogated Dasch in a hotel room while a stenographer took down every detail: the training in Berlin, the U-boat landings, the target lists, the names and addresses of all 8 saboteurs, and the location of contacts in America. Dasch also handed over $82,000 in cash, the bulk of the money the German government had given him to fund years of sabotage. Imagine being George Dasch in that moment. You've spent months training for a mission, crossed the Atlantic in a submarine, landed on an enemy beach, and now you're sitting in a hotel room betraying your country, your teammates, and everything you were sent to do. Why? Dasch later claimed he had always intended to betray the mission, that he had volunteered for the operation specifically to warn the United States and prove his loyalty to America, the country where he had lived most of his adult life. Some historians believe him. Others think he panicked after the Coast Guard encounter and defected out of fear, not principle. Either way, his betrayal sealed the fate of the other saboteurs. The roundup. FBI manhunt. With Dasch providing complete details, the FBI moved quickly. Dasch gave agents Burger's hotel room number in Manhattan. Burger was arrested and immediately cooperated, providing the locations of Quirin and Heinck. They were arrested in New York within days. Curling and Thiel from the Florida team were tracked to Cincinnati and arrested outside the Commodore Hotel. Haupt and Neubauer were found and arrested in Chicago. By June 27, 1942, just 14 days after the first landing, all 8 saboteurs were in FBI custody. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover immediately recognized the propaganda value of the case. He announced the arrests in a press conference, framing the captures as brilliant detective work by the FBI. Newsreels praised Hoover and his agents for protecting the American home front. In reality, the FBI had done almost nothing. Dasch had walked in voluntarily and handed them the entire operation on a platter. Without his confession, the saboteurs might have remained free for weeks or months, potentially completing their mission. But Hoover wasn't about to admit that. He stage-managed the media coverage, took credit for the arrests, and became a national hero. The truth, that a Nazi saboteur had defected and betrayed his team, remained classified. The secret tribunal, Roosevelt's constitutional crisis president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, faced a dilemma. The 8 saboteurs were clearly guilty of attempting sabotage and espionage, but a civilian trial would take months, generate enormous publicity, and potentially reveal intelligence sources and methods. Roosevelt wanted swift justice and a deterrent. Message to Berlin. On July 22, 1942, Roosevelt issued a proclamation establishing a secret military tribunal to try the saboteurs. The tribunal would be closed to the public, operate under military rules of evidence, and could impose death sentences without the possibility of appeal to civilian courts. The constitutionality of the tribunal was immediately challenged. Defense attorneys filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that the saboteurs, 2 of whom were U.S. citizens, had a constitutional right to a civilian trial. The Supreme Court heard arguments in a rare special session in July 1942. In a landmark decision known as ex parte Quirin, the court upheld Roosevelt's military tribunal, ruling that enemy combatants who enter the United States in civilian clothing to commit sabotage are not entitled to the protections of civilian courts. The decision remains controversial to this day. Critics argue it set a dangerous precedent for executive power to bypass constitutional protections during wartime. The trial began on July 8, 1942, in a heavily guarded room in the Department of Justice building. 7 military officers served as judges. The proceedings were closed to the press and public. Each of the 8 defendants was charged with 4 crimes: secretly entering the United States in civilian dress, contrary to the laws of war, communicating with and giving intelligence to enemies of the United States, conspiring to commit sabotage. Attempting to commit sabotage, the evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had recovered the buried explosives, the forged documents, the cash, and detailed confessions from Dasch and Burger. The saboteurs had no plausible defense. On August 1, 1942, the tribunal ended. 2 days later, all 8 were found guilty and sentenced to death. Roosevelt commuted the sentences of Dasch and Burger to 30 years and life in prison, respectively, because they had cooperated and betrayed the mission. The other 6 were given no mercy. On August 8, 1942, Herbert Haupt, Heinrich Heinck, Edward Curling, Hermann Neubauer, Richard Quirin, and Werner Thiel were executed in the electric chair on the third floor of the District of Columbia jail. They were buried in a potter's field in Washington. The entire process, from arrest to execution, had taken less than 6 weeks. The aftermath: arrests, pardons, and bitterness. The FBI didn't stop with the saboteurs. 16 people, including family members and associates of the agents, were arrested for aiding the plot. Herbert Haupt's parents were arrested for helping their son. A Lutheran pastor, Karl Krepper, was convicted of establishing safe houses for the saboteurs and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Dasch and Burger, imprisoned for their cooperation, believed they had been betrayed by the U.S. government. Dasch, in particular, felt he had saved American lives and exposed a Nazi plot, and instead of being rewarded, he had been imprisoned. In 1948, President Harry Truman granted executive clemency to both men, conditional on their permanent deportation to Germany. They were sent to the American occupation zone and forbidden from ever returning to the United States. Dasch spent the rest of his life petitioning for a full pardon and permission to return to America. Every time, Edgar Hoover blocked the request. Hoover didn't want the truth to come out, that the FBI had taken credit for an operation solved by a defector, not detective work. Dasch died in Germany in 1992, bitter and angry, believing he had been treated unjustly. Other plots. How close did it come? Operation Pastorius was not the only German sabotage attempt against the United States, but it was by far the most significant. In late 1944, German intelligence planned a buzz bomb, V-1 flying bomb attack against New York City. The plan involved launching V-1s from U-boats off the East Coast. U.S. military intelligence uncovered the plot before it could be executed. Other schemes, including plans to poison water supplies, assassinate political leaders, and bomb munitions factories, were proposed but never implemented. Most failed because of the same problems that doomed Pastorius: poor planning, unrealistic assumptions about American society, and the difficulty of operating covertly in a foreign country. German intelligence fundamentally misunderstood the United States. They assumed that German Americans would be sympathetic to the Nazi cause and provide support to saboteurs. In reality, most German Americans were fiercely loyal to the United States and hostile to Nazism. Berlin also underestimated the competence of American counterintelligence and the difficulty of moving undetected in a society where strangers were viewed with suspicion. Had Operation Pastorius succeeded, had Dasch not defected, had the saboteurs successfully bombed aluminum plants, bridges, and railroads, the psychological impact on the American home front could have been devastating, but the actual physical damage would likely have been limited. American industrial capacity was so vast that even successful sabotage would have been absorbed and replaced. The greater danger was not what the saboteurs could destroy, but what their presence would reveal: that enemy agents could land on American soil, move freely, and strike at will. That fear, that vulnerability, could have paralyzed morale and diverted resources to domestic security that were needed for the war effort. The uncomfortable, comfortable truth. Here's what we know. In June 1942, 8 Nazi saboteurs landed on U.S. beaches with explosives, cash, and plans to bomb American infrastructure. The mission failed because one saboteur, George Dasch, defected and confessed everything to the FBI. Within 6 weeks, 6 saboteurs had been executed following a secret military tribunal that bypassed constitutional protections. The episode raised profound questions that remain unresolved today. Question 1. Was the military tribunal constitutional? The Supreme Court upheld it in ex parte Quirin, but many constitutional scholars argue the decision was wrong, that even enemy saboteurs deserve due process, especially when 2 were U.S. citizens. The precedent set by ex parte Quirin has been cited to justify modern detention and trial practices that civil libertarians find deeply troubling. Question 2. Was Dasch a hero or a traitor? To Americans, he was a defector who saved lives by exposing a Nazi plot. To Germans, he was a traitor who betrayed his comrades. To Dasch himself, he was a patriot who had tried to serve both Germany and America and ended up betrayed by both. He spent the rest of his life arguing he deserved recognition as an American hero, not punishment as a German spy. Question 3. Did Hoover's deception matter? J. Edgar Hoover took credit for brilliant detective work when in fact the FBI had done almost nothing. Dasch had walked in and confessed. Hoover's version of events became the official narrative used in newsreels, propaganda, and post-war histories. Does it matter that the FBI's greatest counterintelligence success of the war was actually a German failure, not an American triumph? Question 4. What if Pastorius had succeeded? The saboteurs had detailed plans to bomb bridges, railroads, and industrial plants. Had they executed even a few attacks, the psychological impact on the American public would have been enormous. People would have lived in fear that enemy agents were operating freely in their cities. Resources would have been diverted to domestic security. Civil liberties might have been further curtailed. How different would the home front war have looked? Many of you will say the military tribunal was necessary, that in wartime, swift justice and deterrence matter more than procedural rights for enemy saboteurs. You'll point out that Dasch and Burger received leniency for cooperating, and that the 6 who were executed had clearly intended to commit acts of sabotage and terror. Others will say that abandoning constitutional protections, even for enemy agents, sets a dangerous precedent, that the rule of law must apply equally or it doesn't apply at all. You'll argue that Dasch deserved recognition and reward, not imprisonment and deportation, and that Hoover's lies about the FBI's role were unacceptable. Both of those positions have merit. Both raise uncomfortable questions about security, justice, and honesty in wartime. The legacy operation, Pastorius remains the only significant enemy military operation conducted on the U.S. mainland during World War II. It failed, but it came closer to success than most Americans realize. Had Dasch not defected, the saboteurs might have remained undetected for weeks or months. They had excellent cover identities, substantial funding, and knowledge of American society. The explosives they buried could have destroyed critical infrastructure. The psychological impact could have been devastating. Instead, the operation collapsed within days, reinforcing American confidence in the security of the home front and the competence of law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover used the case to build the FBI's reputation as an elite counterintelligence agency. And the precedent of the military tribunal established legal frameworks that continue to shape how the United States treats enemy combatants. But the story also reveals the fragility of security, the moral ambiguity of wartime justice, and the uncomfortable reality that one man's decision, Dasch's crisis of conscience on a Manhattan hotel room, changed the course of the war on the American home front. If George Dasch had kept his nerve, if he had followed through with the mission, American history might have been very different. Bridges might have fallen, factories might have burned, and the fear that had gripped Americans after Pearl Harbor would have intensified into something far worse. Instead, 6 saboteurs died in the electric chair, 2 spent years in prison, and the United States learned that even Nazi Germany couldn't successfully strike the American mainland. But it was closer than most people know. If stories like this matter to you, share this video and subscribe so more people hear them. The saboteurs landed. The plot was real. The threat was genuine.